courthouse hallway was sterile, polished floors reflecting the bright overhead lights, muted voices murmuring behind closed doors. A place where justice was debated but not always found. Keanu Reeves stood motionless in the center of it all, his head slightly bowed. The silver crucifix around his neck shimmered faintly against the dark fabric of his shirt. His fingers brushed over it gently, a quiet act of comfort. A few feet away, a group of uniformed officers laughed. Their voices bounced off the marble walls, sharp and jeering. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gleaming badge, smirked as he pointed at the necklace. "That's supposed to help you, huh?" he scoffed. The others erupted into laughter, their amusement growing as they exchanged smug glances. One officer nudged another, shaking his head in disbelief. "Still holding on to that? Man, wake up." Keanu didn't react. He didn't flinch. Didn't argue. He just stood there. The weight of their mockery pressed against him, but he bore it in silence. His fingers tightened slightly around the cross, his face unreadable, except for the sadness in his eyes. It wasn't the sadness of weakness. It was the sadness of someone who had seen too much. The officers kept laughing, their voices filling the long empty hallway, and yet somehow, they were the ones who seemed small. The laughter rang through the hallway, bouncing off the cold marble walls. It was loud, confident, too confident, the kind of laughter that begged for validation, that sought power in numbers. Keanu remained still, his fingers gently pressing against the crucifix. He didn't look at them, he didn't need to. But the air shifted. Not in a dramatic way, no flickering lights, no eerie sounds. Just a change, a heaviness that settled between them, subtle yet undeniable. The laughter started to thin out, the echoes stretching too long, making the silence that followed even more pronounced. One officer cleared his throat. Another shifted on his feet. The broad-shouldered officer, the ringleader of the mockery, scoffed again, though there was something forced in it this time. "What, no comeback?" he muttered, folding his arms. "Nothing to say?" Keanu finally lifted his head, his gaze met theirs. Not angry, not wounded, just steady. The officer faltered, just for a second. Keanu's voice, when he spoke, was quiet, steady, unshaken. "You don't have to believe in it." The words weren't meant as a challenge, there was no bitterness, no malice, just a simple truth. The officers said nothing. Somewhere down the hall, a courtroom door creaked open, the muffled voice of a judge drifting out before it shut again. The world continued, indifferent to their moment. Keanu exhaled softly, releasing his grip on the cross. Then, without another word, he stepped past them, his boots clicking lightly against the floor. The officers didn't stop him. They just stood there, the weight of something unspoken settling in their chests. And for reasons they couldn't explain, none of them felt like laughing anymore. The hallway felt colder now, though the temperature hadn't changed. The officers stood there, their laughter fully extinguished, yet none of them could explain why. One of them, young, fresh-faced, the kind who usually followed the crowd, rubbed the back of his neck, shifting uncomfortably. "It was just a joke," he muttered, as if saying it aloud would undo the weight pressing down on them. But no one responded. The broad-shouldered officer, the one who had led the mockery, clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what had just happened, only that he suddenly felt exposed, like the moment had turned against him without anyone saying a word. He turned to watch Keanu walk away, his dark coat shifting slightly with each step. The silver crucifix still glinted faintly against his chest, catching the overhead light as if it had absorbed something from the moment. A strange unease settled in. It wasn't fear. It was something worse, a quiet, nagging feeling deep in their bones, the kind that stayed. The broad-shouldered officer exhaled sharply, shaking his head, as if trying to rid himself of the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "Whatever," he muttered under his breath, turning back to his colleagues. "Let's go." But as the group started to move, the youngest officer hesitated. His gaze lingered on Keanu's fading silhouette as he walked down the hallway, his steps calm, unhurried. Something about the moment gnawed at him. The older officers resumed their casual banter, trying to reclaim the lightness that had once filled the space. But the laughter didn't come as easily now. It felt forced, hollow. Then, click. The hallway lights flickered, just once, barely noticeable, yet it was enough to send a quiet ripple of tension through the group. The broad-shouldered officer paused mid-step, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before he scoffed. "Faulty wiring," he mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. The youngest officer swallowed hard. He wasn't so sure. Keanu had already disappeared around the corner, the sound of his footsteps fading. But the weight he left behind, that would linger much longer. The hallway felt stretched, like it had grown longer in Keanu's absence. The officers walked in silence now, the echoes of their own footsteps trailing behind them. The youngest officer cast a glance over his shoulder. The flickering light had settled. The air was still, yet the feeling remained, that something had shifted, something unseen but deeply felt. "All right, enough standing around," the broad-shouldered officer grumbled, rubbing the back of his neck as if shaking off a chill. "Let's move." They nodded, falling in step, but no one spoke. As they approached the courtroom doors, a sudden creak split the silence. The officers froze. One of the wooden doors, the one closest to where Keanu had stood, had swung open on its own. Slowly, deliberately. A deep, aching groan of wood filled the hallway, dragging out longer than it should have. The youngest officer took a step back. His voice caught in his throat. "Did you see that?" No one answered. The broad-shouldered officer's jaw tightened. "Doors stick all the time," he said, though his own stance had stiffened. "Let's go." But as he stepped forward, something cold brushed past him. It wasn't wind, there was no draft in the sealed hallway, no movement in the air. It was something else, something unseen, and it sent a shiver racing down his spine. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he wouldn't dare name. The youngest officer swallowed hard, his gaze shifting back to where Keanu had stood only moments before. He didn't understand what had happened here, but he knew one thing for certain. They should have never laughed at that cross.